So, apparently there's a Wicked movie out right now starring Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo. Has anyone heard of this? I'm kidding, of course, I've already seen it, and I have to say it was pretty good. I almost didn't want it to be any good, what with the disastrous press tour, but at the same time, I'm not really disappointed. I'm a fan of the musical, and a lot of features came to the screen just as I imagined they would. It was cool. But the musical got me thinking about the book. If you were unaware, Wicked the musical is loosely based on a book of the same name. If you've heard anything about this book, you've probably heard that it is very different from the musical, and look, I don't want this video to strictly be about the differences between one and the other, but I do want you to know that this book is very much not the romp that the musical is. I'm not sure how much I can say what with YouTube looming over me like the Wizard of Oz, but let's just say this book is not for kids. At the book's opening, Elphaba listens in on Dorothy and her friends talking about her. Keep in mind, this is the very start of the book. "She was castrated at birth," said the Tin Woodman calmly. "She was born hermaphroditic, or maybe entirely male." "Oh, you see castration everywhere you look," said the Lion. "She was an abused child. She was addicted to medicine for her skin condition." "She's a woman who prefers the company of other women," said the Scarecrow sitting up. "She's the spurned lover of a married man. She is a married man." So, unless you want your kid asking you what castration is, among other questions, maybe save this book for when they're a little older. Beyond the general adult understanding required to read Wicked, there is plenty of objectionable content. There are multiple scenes of intimacy, both consensual and non-consensual. One of those scenes involves an animal. Then there are the murders and other acts of violence. I've read opinions from people online who say that it's all a little too much for them, and that's completely understandable. I'll note that the author, Gregory Maguire, does typically treat these moments with proper seriousness, though I'm not sure if that justifies every inclusion. Moreover, I feel the book has some contradictions, not just with The Wizard of Oz, but with itself. I didn't know going into the book that it's actually part of a series. I also don't know if that was Maguire's intention when writing the first book, but perhaps the next books in the series answer for some of the things that don't quite make sense. For all the book's shortcomings, I was thoroughly entertained, and I knew I wanted to talk about it. While Maguire includes some adult aspects that might seem gratuitous, other complex aspects really shine. As much as I love the musical, it's pretty simple, and there's nothing wrong with that. I strive for simplicity in writing, but I suppose the strength of a novel compared to a stage show is the room an author has to explore. So, just as Maguire explores the big ideas in his book, I want to explore them with you. We're going to take a look at Wicked's exploration of tyranny and fascism, poetry and art, good and evil, and last but not least, destiny. That we may all hold space for the wisdom in this book. Oh, and if it wasn't clear, spoilers for the book will follow. Also, I'm going to forego the summary. I'll provide some context as we go. If you've seen the play, that'll help, even though it doesn't follow the book very particularly. Part 1. Tyranny and Fascism. Before we get straight into fascism, another big idea presented in the book is religion. I thought to include religion as its own part, but in truth, I didn't have much to say about it, not much that I couldn't intertwine with these other parts anyway. For example, at the beginning of the book, we see religious unrest among the Munchkins. Elphaba's father, a Munchkin minister named Frexbar the Godly, says, "It is a time of crisis for our society. We stand at a crossroads. Idolatry looms, traditional values in jeopardy, truth under siege, and virtue abandoned." One budding religion, TikTokism, yes, that's actually what it's called, drives the Munchkinlanders into a bit of hysteria. In the chaos, the Time Dragon tries to sway the Munchkinlanders to kill Frex. In a system as volatile as this, where citizens are persuaded so easily to violence, is it any wonder that fascism crept in? Before we go on, we'd best define fascism. Now, keep in mind, definitions may vary, but Webster's is adequate. A populist political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, that is associated with a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, and that is characterized by severe economic and social regimentation and by forcible suppression of opposition. In Wicked, the wizard is, of course, the dictatorial leader. He obtains power during Oz's more volatile period in a coup. Most of his power is observable in the Emerald City. His police are militaristic and don't hesitate to kill. Just like in the musical, he makes an enemy of the animals. Also, note, the book distinguishes between animals with a lowercase a and animals with an uppercase a. Animals, uppercase, can think and speak like humans, but over time the wizard essentially exterminates all the free-thinking animals, or otherwise makes them no different from lowercase animals. Galinda speaks briefly about the animal rights issues with the Shiz biology teacher, Dr. Dillamond, a goat. Their exchange is as follows. How many animals have you ever seen in this paradise of education? Well, it was true. There were none. Well, I do think it's pretty dreadful, said Galinda. Why would the Wizard of Oz do such a thing? Why indeed, said the goat. No, really, why? It's a real question. I don't know. I don't know either. Indeed, there never seems to be any reason for marginalization, not any rational reason, that is. Tyranny, oppression, exclusion, these things seem to happen on the whims of bad people. The animals aren't the only marginalized group, but they are perhaps the most notable. One character, Princess Nastoya, a shape-shifting elephant, says, "When the times are a crucible, when the air is full of crisis, those who are the most themselves are the victims. Ergo, those who don't conform cannot survive in a fascist regime." These words were poignant when Maguire published them in 1995, and they're still poignant today. Before we move on entirely from religion, there is just one more point I'd like to emphasize. In the book, Elphaba's sister, Nessa, is a religious fanatic. She eventually comes to rule Munchkinland, and her religious zeal makes even her father nervous. Freck says, Nessa Rose hides behind her devotion the way a terrorist hides behind his ideals. I don't think Maguire is criticizing religion itself, but religious systems. When people use religion to oppress, that's when we have a problem. For all the wizard's wrongdoings, at least he allows religious liberty, but that's not saying much. Over and over again, we're told just how despotic the wizard really is. When Elphaba's childhood caretaker reunites with her in the West, they have the following exchange. "Well, our redoubtable wizard has crowned himself emperor," said Nanny. "Did you know that?" They hadn't heard. "By whose authority?" asked Five, scoffing. "And furthermore, emperor over what?" "There isn't anyone who has any more authority," he said Nanny calmly. "And who could argue with that? As for emperor over what, I couldn't say. Some people whisper that this implies expansionist aims, but where he could expand to, I couldn't say. I just couldn't." In an earlier instance, Shiz matriarch Madame Morrible says, "A strong fist does wonders in a rotten situation. Walk softly, but carry a bit stick." This bit stick business is a not-so-subtle reference to big stick ideology or big stick diplomacy. Theodore Roosevelt would often say, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far." And the saying came to refer to his foreign policy approach. As Wikipedia explains, the idea is negotiating peacefully, but also having strength in case things go wrong. We see that the wizard is all too eager to wield the big stick without much need to speak softly. But despite the wizard's irredeemable portrayal in Wicked, Maguire curiously gives the character a shred of sympathy. Toward the end of the book, Elphaba has a vision of the wizard's life back on Earth. Quote, "In one window, in a shop from which the wizard was emerging rather dejectedly, she thought she caught some words once and willed herself with tremendous effort to wake up so she could write them down, but they didn't make any sense to her. No Irish need apply." End quote. Perhaps the wizard rules the way he does because of his environment back in Kansas. That obviously doesn't justify any of his actions, but it certainly makes a reader wonder, to what extent is the wizard his own agent? Does he know any other way of being outside of marginalization? Is he nothing more than a product of his environment? We'll come back to these questions later. Another way the wizard exerts his authoritarian control is through the control of information. At Shiz, Dr. Dillamond works on important research that would put animals on the same pedestal as other living beings. Basically, he seeks to prove how biologically similar animals are to the other residents of Oz. Elphaba helps him with his research and hopes to present it to the wizard. She says, "The wizard is a man in power. It's his job to consider changes in knowledge." Wouldn't that be something, for men in power to rule according to the best information available to them? Dr. Dillamond is later murdered by Madame Morrible's TikTok servant. Eventually, Elphaba and Glinda secure an audience with the wizard. Elphaba brings up Dr. Dillamond's research, but the wizard all but ignores it. He says, "The thing is, my green girlie, it is not for a girl or a student or a citizen to assess what is wrong. This is the job of leaders and why we exist." Does it get more despotic than that? That's like genuinely cult ideology, a strongman leader who can never be questioned. And since the wizard controls the circulation of information, he can bend knowledge to his whim. It's pure propaganda. And speaking of propaganda, Part 2, Poetry and Art. I was surprised to see poetry as a recurring motif throughout the book. In Elphaba and Glinda's time at Shiz, Madame Morrible performs a reading of 2 poems in the form of a quell, a fictional poetry form in the Land of Oz. Quells feature 13 lines that rhyme, though seemingly without any strict rhyme scheme, and a final line that doesn't rhyme. Here is the first quell that Morrible recites. Sing a hymn to rectitude, ye forward-thinking multitude, advance in humble gratitude for strictest rules of attitude. To elevate the common good, in brotherhood and sisterhood, we celebrate authority, fraternity, sorority. United, pressing onward, we restrict the ills of liberty. There is no numinosity, like power's generosity, in helping curb atrocity. Bear down on the rod and foil the child. So this poem is a pretty overt love letter to authoritarianism. I mean, look at these phrases: strictest rules of attitude, celebrate authority, restrict the ills of liberty, etc. There's really not much more to say. It's about as straightforward as a poem can be. And that last line, bear down on the rod and foil the child, is the phrase, spare the rod and spoil the child, but turned on its head. Rather than quote-unquote spoiling the child by refraining from punishment, the poem argues that one should punish a child to teach them rectitude. Ergo, force is always justified in producing desired results. The next quell is the one that really gets the listeners buzzing. Alas for impropriety, the guillotine of piety, to remedy society, indulge not in satiety, in mirth and shameless gaiety, choosing sobering sobriety, behave as if the deity approaches in its mystery, and greet it with sonority. Let your especial history be built upon sorority, whose virtues do exemplify, and social good thus multiply. Animals should be seen and not heard. When Dr. Dillamond hears this poem, he speaks up and calls it anti-animal propaganda outright. Madame Morrible defends the controversial poem by saying, one expects poetry, if it is poetry, to offend. It is the right of art. Now, on the one hand, I actually kind of agree with Madame Morrible. I do think art has the right to offend or shock. Good art does stir something in the viewer, doesn't it? And what easier way to stir someone than to offend? Put a pin in that, by the way. However, I can't help but feel Madame Morrible's defense here sounds like those free speech advocates who claim that it's a free country when they get caught with a bad take. Later, Morrible doubles down on the ill-received poem, but with a different defense. Elphaba questions the teacher about the poem in front of her peers. Well, Dr. Dillamond seemed to think the poems were in questionable taste given the bans on animal mobility. Dr. Dillamond, alas, said Madame Morrible, is a doctor. He is not a poet. He is also a goat, and I might ask you girls if we have ever had a great goat sonneteer or balladeer. Alas, dear Miss Elphaba, Dr. Dillamond doesn't understand the poetic convention of irony. Irony presupposes detachment, which, alas, in the case of animal rights, we may forgive Dr. Dillamond for being without. So that phrase he objected to, animals should be seen and not heard, that was ironic? One could consider it an ironic mode if one chooses, said Madame Morrible. How do you choose? Said Elphaba. How impertinent, said Madame Morrible. Well, but I don't mean impertinence, I'm trying to learn. If anyone thought that statement was true, then it isn't in conflict with the boring bossy bit that preceded it. It's just argument and conclusion, and I don't see the irony. You don't see much, Miss Elphaba, said Madame Morrible. You must learn to put yourself in the shoes of someone wiser than you are, and look from that angle. But I was trying to put myself in the shoes of Dr. Dillamond, said Elphaba, almost whining but not giving up. In the case of poetic interpretation, I venture to suggest it may indeed be true. Animals should not be heard, snapped Madame Morrible. Do you mean that ironically? Said Elphaba. Here, Morrible is what we would call Schrodinger's douchebag. Because the poem didn't go over well with the audience, Morrible claims the whole thing was ironic. When Elphaba asks where the irony was, Morrible says Elphaba is too foolish to see it. We recognize these tactics, don't we, people? Especially thanks to forums like Twitter. This, it would seem, is Elphaba's first real experience with poetry, and it sours her on the art form for the rest of her life. Later in life, Elphaba says, I have a notion that poetry is the highest form of self-deception. Then, some years after that, she adds, poets are just as responsible for empire building as any other professional hacks. Now, she actually sort of has a point, doesn't she? Wicked even offers an example of what she's talking about. In the Land of Oz, there's a religious text called the Oziad. In one discussion about the book, a character says, You fools, the Oziad is just a frilly romantic poem of older, harsher legends. What lives in folk memory is truer than how some artsy poet says it. In folk memory, evil always predates good. Let's compare the Osiad to its real-world counterpart, the Bible. Many folks argue that the Bible is just poetry and fairy tales from years and years ago. Other folks hold the Bible up as an absolutely true document of historicity. No matter which stance you take, you can't deny that the Bible is a pretty influential piece of poetry. Remember earlier when I said I sort of agreed with Morrible when she said that it was the right of art to offend? I do agree that art certainly has the right, but I disagree that poetry is only poetry when it offends. That would be silly. Another character, the sorcery teacher at Shiz, puts it far more agreeably than Morrible does. Quote, "Sorcery is art. One might in fact call it the superior or the finest art. It bypasses the fine arts of painting and drama and recitation. It doesn't pose or represent the world, it becomes. A very noble calling. Can there be a higher desire than to change the world?" End quote. The finest art doesn't just represent the world, it becomes. The truest art is change. I would argue that art's purpose is to create a change, not necessarily in the world, but at least within the viewer. Oftentimes we criticize bad art because it has no effect on us. Conversely, we praise great art because it moves something within us. Regarding the Bible, perhaps everyone who's ever read it has almost certainly felt a change, whether that's pro-Bible, anti-Bible, pro-religion, anti-religion, whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is we can measure the Bible's effectiveness as a piece of art because of the change it affects and has affected over the years. Let's take another piece of art, Duchamp's Fountain. Now, I don't like this sculpture, but I can't deny its effect. It does stir something within me, and it stirred something within the art world too. See my Spider-Verse video for more on that. Elphaba puts it better than I can. When Morrible is reading her quells, Elphaba asks Galinda what she thinks. Galinda doesn't want to answer, so Elphaba says, "Well, your opinion is as good as hers, I think. That's the real power of art, I think. Not to chide, but to provoke challenge. Otherwise, why bother?" Well said. Art isn't simply meant to offend, it's meant to provoke challenge. When two people can look at a piece of art and form different opinions, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Sometimes we see art that offends but doesn't actually provoke anything. We often call that shock value. Other times we see art that provokes challenge without offending at all. It's really very interesting, and it's a shame that Elphaba grew so soured on poetry because of Madame Morrible's propaganda pieces. But I digress. Speaking of Elphaba growing soured, let's talk about Part 3, Good and Evil. Wicked is very much a dissection of good and evil, and an analysis as to where evil comes from. The people of Oz ruminate on evil in the same way that we do. For example, for Elphaba's ultra-religious father, Maguire writes, "He began to mumble in a general way about the nature of evil, a vacuum set up by the inexplicable absence of the unnamed God, and into which spiritual poison must rush, a vortex." That's not so dissimilar to the way religious people in our world think about evil, despite their belief in an all-good, all-powerful God. Others suppose evil simply comes from the failings of the human body. I've heard this called the natural man. Frex's cousin explains, all souls are hostages to their human envelopes. Elphaba's mother says something quite similar. I feel like a hostage to myself. However, we see the contradictions there, don't we? Why would an all-good God allow evil to exist? Why would a God create good souls but evil bodies? And I know theologians have their answers to these questions. I'm just trying to say that no answer is truly satisfactory. We'll take a look at non-superstitious folks in just a second, but first, let's consider Elphaba's mother, Melina. Shortly after Elphaba's birth, Melina feels utterly depressed. She feels Elphaba, with her green skin and shark-like teeth, is evil incarnate. Part of her believes Elphaba is punishment for infidelity that she doesn't remember. Shortly thereafter, Melina has an affair with a quadling named Turtleheart. Maguire tells us, somehow Turtleheart had saved her and restored her sense of grace, of hope in the world. Her belief in the goodness of things had been dashed into bits when little green Elphaba crawled into being. The child was extravagant punishment for a sin so minor she didn't even know if she had committed it. So in other words, Elphaba allegedly came to be due to sin, which depressed Melina. But then Melina starts sinning again with Turtleheart, and that restores her belief in goodness? Again, we see the contradictions. For irreligious people like Elphaba, it's not that evil predates humans, but it's humans who cause evil. As Elphaba says while freedom fighting for the animals, I never use the word humanist or humanitarian, as it seems to me that to be human is to be capable of the most heinous crimes in nature. Toward the end of the book, she also says, "It isn't hard to find evil in this world," said the witch. Evil is always more easily imagined than good somehow. Many people would likely agree with Elphaba, especially when observing the corrupt rulers of the world. As one animal observes, my own feeling is that there is real evil abroad in the land. The wizard sets the standard for it, and the society follows suit like a bunch of sheep. But as it turns out, even opinions like these aren't without their contradictions. Considering all that Elphaba lives through, it makes sense for her to think the world is void of goodness in the end. Of course, that's when Dorothy comes stumbling in. Elphaba is of course expecting Dorothy. She knows that Dorothy was sent by the wizards to kill her, and yet Dorothy doesn't seem to want to. When they said that it was your sister, and that we had to come here, it was like a prison sentence, and I never wanted to, but I thought, well, I would come, and my friends would come with me to help, and I would come, and I would say, "Say what?" cried the witch on the edge. "I would say," and the girl straightened up, gritting her teeth, "I would say to you, would you ever forgive me for that accident, for the death of your sister? Would you ever forgive me, for I could never forgive myself?" The witch shrieked in panic, in disbelief, that even now the world should twist so, offending her once again. Elphaba now begged by a gibbering child for the same mercy always denied her. Elphaba cannot comprehend Dorothy's goodness, hence the panicked shriek. And in the end, tragically, it's Dorothy's goodness that undoes Elphaba completely. But was that always how things were meant to be for Elphaba? Part 4. Destiny. As I said before, in Wicked, good and bad aren't set in stone, they just are. When it comes to Elphaba, both of her parents consider her a curse, a cruel result of their own actions. But is that really the case? Quote, "Was Elphaba devil's spawn? Was she half-elf? Was she punishment for her father's failure as a preacher, or her mother's sloppy morals and bad memory? Or was she merely a physical ailment, a blight like a misshapen apple or a five-legged calf?" End quote. Galinda, thanks to her natural beauty, faces the opposite considerations that Elphaba and her family do. Quote, "Galinda reasoned that because she was beautiful, she was significant, though what she signified and to whom was not clear to her yet." End quote. In a way, Galinda was right, she did become significant. But ultimately, Galinda, once she's known as Glinda, comes to the realization that she didn't become significant just because she was supposed to be. She takes on a much more complicated understanding of free will by the book's end. Here's the conversation she has with Elphaba when the two are grown. "Glinda, is it possible we could be living our entire adult lives under someone's spell? How could we tell if we were the pawns of someone else's darker game? How do you know your life hasn't been pulled by the strings of some malign magic?" "Well, I pray a lot," said Glinda. "Not terribly genuinely, I admit, but I try. I think the unnamed god would have mercy on me and give me the benefit of the doubt, and release me from a spell if I had accidentally fallen under one. Don't you? Or are you still so atheistic?" "I have always felt like a pawn," said the witch. "My skin color's been a curse, my missionary parents made me sober and intense, my school days brought me up against political crimes against animals, my love life imploded and my lover died, and if I had any life's work of my own, I haven't found it yet, except in animal husbandry, if you could call it that." "I'm no pawn," said Glinda. "I take all the credit in the world for my own foolishness. Good gracious, dear, all of life is a spell. You know that. But you do have some choice." "Well, I wonder," said the witch. You'll notice that Elphaba isn't quite so sure when it comes to matters of free will. Elphaba is a skeptic at heart. Those around her have to remind her over and over again that choice does exist. Princess Nastoya tells Elphaba, "Remember this, nothing is written in the stars, not these stars nor any others. No one controls your destiny." Still, Elphaba can see how the choices of one affect the choices of another. She says, "Madame Morrible had a choice. No one was better placed than she to see that her students got an education and not a brainwashing. By hooking up with the Emerald City, she sold out all her students who believed that a liberal education meant learning to think for themselves." Much like the wizard was a product of his environment, all of Morrible's students were products of theirs, including Elphaba. That's why fascists are so concerned with controlling education. However, as much as Morrible influenced her students, Elphaba remembers Nastoya's words. No one controls your destiny. Even at the very worst, there is always a choice. These words are both disappointing and comforting. On the one hand, it's kind of a bummer that we can't always excuse our poor actions, but it's good to know that when all is going wrong, we can still claim some measure of control in our lives. It's a shame Elphaba couldn't see that in the end. But interestingly, Maguire sort of undermines this message. He implies that some things are dictated by higher powers. Late into the book, Elphaba meets a dwarf who watches over the grimoire. The dwarf explains, "I am the silent partner. I work through events. I live on the sidelines. I dabble in causes and effects. I watch how the misbegotten creatures of this world live their lives. I interfere only to keep the book safe." Now, granted, Elphaba might have been in a drunken stupor and hallucinated this whole thing, but I don't think so. The dwarf also revealed the implied reason that Elphaba is really green. Quote, "You are neither this nor that, or shall I say both this and that, both of Oz and of the other world. Your old Frex always was wrong. You were never a punishment for his crimes. You are a half-breed. You are a new breed. You are a grafted limb. You are a dangerous anomaly." End quote. What the dwarf is implying, and what the book later all but confirms, is that Elphaba is green because the wizard drugged Melina with green miracle elixir from Earth and got her pregnant. But did that happen as a matter of fate? No, not at all. That said, Elphaba's not so wrong to think that she was a pawn all her life. Even when she grew out of her religious home, Madame Morrible and the wizard constantly surveilled Elphaba. It's no wonder she felt she never had a choice in anything. In the end, Elphaba probably felt the only thing she could choose was wickedness. Elphaba's story is a tragic one. In the end, the solace we take is that Dorothy could prevail where Elphaba couldn't. By the book's end, the wizard knows he can't stay in Oz any longer. He flees the land and narrowly misses an attempt on his life. And Dorothy inspires the citizens of Oz with her goodness. Each of us is a product of our environment, but each of us is also an individual agent. Keeping both of those things in mind, don't we owe it to each other to try and be good? It's hard to blame Elphaba considering everything she went through. In her case, we find ourselves asking, what if? Let's take the proper steps today so we don't have to ask what if down the line. But what do you think? Have you read Wicked? What do you think of the book compared to other interpretations? What do you think of Elphaba? Please tell me everything. And hey, all this talk of Elphaba reminds me of this poem. This piece is titled Cracks by one of my patrons, Zagreus. The poem reads, "Cracks in the ceiling, cracks in my head, cracks let in water, that's what my mother said. And moisture makes it humid, and humidity breeds mold. It's appalling for your health. Yes, that's what I was told. That's why I wear a raincoat, to keep the water out. I just can't take the risk, even in this drought." For the chance to see your work at the end of one of my videos, or if you just enjoy what I do and want to support, you can join the Patreon too. Here are all the patrons who have made videos like this possible recently. I really can't thank them enough, especially as I'm trying to dedicate more time to YouTube this month. You can help the channel in other important ways by doing all the things the algorithm likes, especially by sharing this video. And if you want, you can follow me on my socials. Oh, also, you can submit work for review on the second channel. Just be aware of the backlog. And ultimately, keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And maybe now that this video is over, I can finally get the musical soundtrack out of my head.